This industry runs on trust, and that's exactly what fraudsters are counting on. There was an 18% spike in cargo theft last year, which is $725 million in loss. And most of this didn't happen with a crowbar. It happened with a phone call and a fake MC number. Let's talk about it. What's going on, everybody? Welcome back. Thank you so much for joining me today. My name is Jen, and this is my podcast, Behind the Wheel. I'm so glad you guys are with me. And today we're getting into freight fraud and cargo theft. And I want to try and approach this one on the same way we typically try to approach everything on this show, which is honesty and from the ground up rather than from 30,000 feet in the air. Because this is one of those topics where the headline numbers are bad enough on their own. But the real story is what this kind of crime actually does to the people trying to operate clean in a business that's already hard enough. And I think that's the piece that tends to get lost when fraud gets covered as just a typical crime statistic. The damage, honestly, isn't just financial. It changes how the people in this industry tend to operate. You know, they tend to trust the next phone call less, or the next load offer less, or the next carrier packet less. It tends to add a layer of suspicion and friction to every transaction that honest people are now expected to carry. I feel like the scale of this problem has crossed the threshold where it's no longer reasonable to treat it as a background issue. CargoNet reported that confirmed cargo theft incidents rose 18% year over year in 2025, which basically comes out to about 2,600 documented thefts across the US and Canada. The estimated loss for 1 year came in around $725 million. Those aren't numbers that belong in a footnote somewhere. That's a significant accelerating threat operating across the full geographic footprint of this industry. The weird part is what changed isn't just the volume, it's also the sophistication of how this is happening. The image of cargo theft as a purely physical crime is increasingly incomplete. A growing share of what's happening now lives inside the paperwork or the digital systems and the identity layer of the business. FMCSA has been explicit about this, warning that fraud schemes increasingly involved bad actors using another carrier's US DOT number without authorization. And they're posing as legitimate brokers without proper registration, or they're building convincing fake identities that can survive a casual vetting check. The agency has been posted alerts about scammers spoofing official FMCSA web addresses to intercept communications and impersonate the agency itself. When the fraudsters are sophisticated enough to impersonate federal regulators, the problem has moved well beyond opportunistic theft. Double brokering has emerged as one of the most talked about vectors, and for good reason. It's exploiting the speed and trust-dependent nature of freight brokerage in a way that's hard to catch in real time. A load will get booked, it'll be rebrokered without authorization to another party, and by the time the discrepancy surfaces, the cargo has moved, the money has moved, and accountability has become genuinely complicated. Small carriers are particularly exposed here because they often lack the back office infrastructure to catch the warning signs before they've already committed to the load. On the legislative side, FreightWaves reported in February of 2026 that Senate legislation aimed at restoring FMCSA's enforcement authority over freight fraud and also tightening rules around double brokering had advanced through committee. I mean, whether that ultimately produces, meaningful enforcement is still an open question. But the fact that it's moving at all, it signals that the problem has become visible enough that ignoring it politically is really no longer viable. That's kind of a shift worth noting. Even if the distance between a Senate committee vote and actual road level accountability remains pretty significant, the picture these data points put together is one of an industry where the fraud environment has genuinely worsened. Not marginally, but structurally. The methods are a lot smarter, the targets are wider, and the identity-based schemes are harder to defend against than the physical threat of the, previous era. Freight fraud works because trucking runs on urgency and trust. Those two things are not weaknesses in isolation. They are what make the business function, essentially. Loads typically need to be covered quickly, so decisions get made fast because they have to. People extend their trust to brokers, carriers, and dispatchers that they've never met in person, because the alternative is a business that moves too slowly to survive. That system works the overwhelming majority of the time, but it also creates exactly the conditions a sophisticated scammer needs to operate. Speed reduces verification. Trust, it will reduce the scrutiny. And urgency, which is the constant pressure point to decide now, confirm now, and move on, is the scammer's most reliable tool, essentially. Think about how a double brokering scheme actually, unfolds from the inside. It doesn't arrive looking like a scheme. It arrives looking like a normal load offer, priced reasonably with documents that pass a quick look over. From a company name that might even be familiar to you. The pressure to confirm is real. The timeline is tight, and by the time something feels off, the decision has usually already been made. And that's not carelessness on the carrier's part. That's a scheme specifically engineered to exploit the normal pace of the business. Small carriers and owner-operators feel this most acutely, and not just because they have less institutional support when something goes wrong. It's because the decision in a small operation are often made by one or two people who are simultaneously managing dispatch, compliance, customer relationships, and whatever crisis is happening today. The margin for a lengthy verification process on every load offer is very slim, and scammers know that the targeting of small carriers isn't random, it's deliberate. Because small operators are more likely to make faster decisions and less likely to have the resources to chase recovery after the fact. The damage from a single successful fraud event on a small carrier can be severe in ways that don't fully show up in an industry report. It's not just the direct financial loss, though that can be devastating on its own. It's the downstream effects, the insurance complication, the customer relationship damaged, the time spent to unravel what happened instead of running your business. And also the erosion of confidence that makes every subsequent transaction feel so much heavier. One bad load at the wrong moment can put a small operation in a genuinely precarious and dangerous position. And the system that allowed the fraud to happen typically doesn't offer a lot of recovery support. What the industry can actually do about this breaks into several categories. The first is slowing down verification without surrendering to the paralysis, right? Building simple, consistent checks into the load acceptance process that, doesn't require a full investigation, but they do create a meaningful barrier. Confirming carrier identity directly through the FMCSA's safer system, rather than relying solely on what a broker or load board presents. Calling the number listed in official registrations, rather than the number provided in the offer. I don't really see these as radical measures. They're friction, deliberately applied at the point where fraud is most likely to enter. I think the second is industry level accountability for, the identity exploitation. If a carrier's US DOT number gets used fraudulently, the process for reporting it, flagging it, and protecting that carrier's reputation needs to be faster and more accessible than it currently is. Right now, a carrier can find themselves associated with a fraudulent load they had nothing to do with. And the path to clearing their name runs through a very long bureaucratic process that wasn't designed for the speed at which these schemes operate. The third is cultural. The industry has to stop treating fraud as like an individual failure, as something that happened to a particular carrier because they weren't careful enough. They need to start treating it like a systematic problem that requires systematic responses. Because when fraud gets framed as a personal failure, the burden of prevention lands entirely on the most vulnerable players, which is exactly where it does not belong. So here's the thing about fraud that I keep coming back to, which is the direct cost, the stolen cargo and the lost loads, the $725 million figure CargoNet put on 2025 losses. That's real and significant, and it's definitely worth taking seriously on its own terms. But there's also an indirect cost that doesn't show up in any reports, and I think it's the more insidious one. It's the cost of a business operating under sustained suspicion. Every legitimate carrier who now gets met with extra skepticism because bad actors poison the pool. Every honest broker who has to work harder to establish that credibility because the category has been exploited enough that trust has to be rebuilt from scratch on every call. Every small operator who now has to spend time and energy on fraud prevention that they would have spent on actually running their business. That friction is very real. It's everywhere, and it compounds. It makes the honest side of this industry more expensive to operate and less efficient by exactly the amount that fraud has succeeded in making it harder to trust the normal signals. There's a version of this that I feel like, if it's left unaddressed, starts reshaping how the industry functions at a foundational level. When speed and trust, which are the things that make freight brokerage work, start feeling dangerous rather than functional, people compensate. They will slow down. They will add layers. They default to their known relationships, and they become less open to new ones. Some of that is, honestly, it's reasonable and protective. But taken too far, it can also calcify the market. It brings a disadvantage to new brokerages who haven't yet built a track record, and shifts competitive advantage toward whoever has the longest established relationships rather than whoever is doing the best work. That's not really a healthy outcome either for an industry that is supposed to be accessible to the owner-operator running one truck as much as to a carrier running 1,000. The legislative movement is encouraging in the sense that it indicates the problem has become too visible to ignore. But legislation that restores FMCSA enforcement authority is only useful to the extent that the enforcement actually reaches the people doing the damage at the speed at which they operate. Fraudulent operations are often deliberately structured to be disposable. New entities, rotated identities, jurisdictional complications. The regulatory framework was not built with that kind of adversary in mind, and updating it in a longer project than any single bill represents. What matters most in the near term is that people most exposed to this, which is the small carriers, the owner-operators, The dispatcher's making pretty fast decisions with very limited support. They need to have better tools or information and a clearer understanding of where the vulnerabilities actually are, because they're the ones who can least afford to learn through, this fraudulent experience. All right, drivers, so that's going to be it for today's episode. Again, thank you so much for joining me today. If you liked the video, please subscribe to the channel, like the video, leave a comment down below. Let me know what your thoughts are. Let me know if any of you have experienced any type of fraudulent activity within the last couple of years, especially. With that being said, thank you so much, guys. I will see you in the next video.